Public Policy Forum. We got an exciting night for you guys tonight. We're going to be discussing two key interesting topics. One is going to be about the Paris Agreement, which was passed earlier this year, and the other one is going to be about Citizens United. The money that we get tonight will be working directly towards funding our political science scholarships that we give to our students every year. Let's first off, for those of you who do not know, let's go into the first topic. We're not going to beat around the bush here, we're just going to get straight through this. First off, we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of the Paris Agreement. For those of you who don't know, the Paris Agreement was signed earlier this year, and it was a UN framework that essentially many countries signed, and it's a global, basically, contract for nations to decrease the number of greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to be setting standards for each other and holding each other accountable to that. Now there are going to be two teams, which will be split, with one side illustrating the necessity of such a framework, while the other side will be saying that this is not a good idea. The pros will be discussed by Rachel and Mia on Team A, while the cons will be headed by Joe and Brittany on Team B. I'm going to hand the floor over to the pro side with Rachel and Mia.
So last December, 195 countries came together to create an agreement. And just last Friday, 175 countries came together to sign the Paris Agreement, a monumental document in which every country pledged to take a stand and save the environment. This document was about more than politics. It was about progress. And when this agreement was signed into action, progress won. Paris approached climate change from three ambitious fronts: capping current pollution, including formerly excluded countries in the climate change debate, and promoting strong support from some of the largest fossil fuel users and producers. The importance of this cannot be understated, because goals this strong had never been accomplished before in the history of the United Nations, and more countries than ever recognize the imminent threat of climate change, taking the first step towards a feasible solution. Not only did the Paris Agreement accomplish important aims, establishing the most substantive document battling climate change yet, it also brought world leaders from both the developing and developed world together for the first time, forming a united front to save our future. At the core of this agreement is a limitation on global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. This standard is much lower than the projections of temperature rise before the document was made. So why should you care? Without a worldwide change, the ocean will rise over 5 feet in the near future. This wouldn't just stop us from swimming at the beach. It is projected that over 15,000 people in Orange County alone could lose their homes, their jobs, their lives due to the direct result of ocean flooding. The ultimate truth of this problem is self-evident. Our response must come today. The Paris Agreement is just that response, working towards stopping that 5-foot ocean rise by combating the problem at the international level. The indisputable fact that every country has signed on means that every country recognizes that something needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. One of the failures of the previous document regarding climate change, called the Kyoto Protocol, was its focus on developed countries. Ones like the United States, where we don't have to think about how much it costs to turn on the water or even keep on the lights in this room. This agreement extends well beyond that narrow scope, still addressing these developed countries while also including developing nations such as India, which the previous document failed to include. Continuing with the Kyoto Protocol would allow these developing countries to raise their consumption levels towards those of the US, a dangerous situation that would require 4 whole Earths to sustain. In recognition of this, the Paris Agreement moves away from that dangerous reality and progresses towards a cleaner, safer, and better world. The Paris Agreement notably includes 2 important signatories that were missing from the Kyoto Protocol: China and the United States. China is the largest producer and largest consumer of fossil fuels worldwide, with the US coming in at a close second, demonstrating the imminent need to have them included in the international discussion on climate change. The absence of China and the US made the suggestions in the Kyoto Protocol seem unimportant, especially to developing countries. However, China and the US were not only included in this discussion, they were some of the largest advocates of the agreement, and their work towards lowering this pollution, along with the model it sets for other countries, makes this document extremely more effective and promotes progress in several industries. A key component of the document is the commitment of every country to stop using fossil fuels in the near future. As mentioned, some of the world's largest producers of fossil fuels are in full support of the Paris Agreement. Even Saudi Arabia, the country that produces the most oil worldwide, has taken the initiative to set an example for the international community by committing to cycle oil out of its economy within the next 20 years. This is progress exemplified, where even the largest countries involved in the oil industry are avidly finding alternative solutions. Others will follow. This overwhelming change cannot and will not occur overnight, and this may not bring Earth to its pre-industrial revolutionary health. However, this document is proof of progress, proof of collaboration, proof that we as a human race have not only recognized the amount of damage we have had on our planet, we are actively working towards reversing it. The Paris Agreement represents victory on two fronts: the ability of the international community to come to a consensus and the precedent-setting environmental standard it created. Yes, more could be done, but the fact that we are changing, we are improving, we are promoting progress is indicative of the fact that we have turned the tide, and we are now marching in the right direction towards this extremely important issue. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to be hearing from the comm side. Joe is going to be up first, and then we're going to bounce back to Rachel and then Brittany.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today, and I'd also like to thank Mia, because she's absolutely right. In order for the Paris Agreement to be successful, it does require both China and the United States. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, despite what our opposition may say, we're not making a case against climate change. That's not up for debate. An overwhelming majority of scientists concur that our climate is changing. In fact, we're making a case that the Paris Agreement is all hype and no action. We will look into the reasons as to why the Paris Agreement will not work at home in America, and we know from history that America set the tone for global agreements. Now, Albert Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. Yet here we are. Recalling the infamous Kyoto Protocol, which is unfortunately not a satire, it has been referred to as good intentions but failed legislation. I will demonstrate that the Kyoto Protocol is no different from the Paris Agreement. First, I ask, why was Kyoto unsuccessful? Well, its failure is largely attributed to its lack of political commitment globally and then its soft wording, making it a non-binding agreement. However, let's put off the global aspect for just a moment and focus on the political climate here in the United States that led Kyoto Protocol and its failure to reach the proposed objectives. In order for the U.S. to become a signatory to this agreement, it needs to be ratified by the Senate with a 2/3 majority. In 1997, the Beard-Hagel resolution passed unanimously. It emphasized that the United States would not sign any treaty that would harm American economy or exempt the developing nations. The credibility of the United States is not enhanced when administrations negotiate a treaty that has no hope of ratification in the Senate. As a result, the Clinton administration never even sent Kyoto to the Senate for a vote. At this time, America was the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the world. Now, the agreement Clinton endorsed on the global stage was for a reduction in world greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. When it was all said and done, the United States had increased their emissions by 20%, while India increased by 103%, and China increased by 150%. Now, parallel this to today, President Obama stated that he committed this country to the tireless task of combating climate change. However, the United States is a system of laws and checks and balances that prevent our president from acting unilaterally. If this was China, the executive could enact any legislation without any debate. But in a democratic society as ours, this agreement is out of our president's hands alone. The U.S. Constitution states that an international agreement providing for the payment of money by the United States requires an appropriation of funds by Congress in order to effect the payment required by the agreement. This means that our president lacks the authority to bind the United States to any agreement without the Senate's support. In 1997, Clinton faced a Republican majority House. Seeing as that today's Senate is held by a majority of 54 Republicans, our president would be hard-pressed to get the 67-vote requirement to enact the Paris Agreement. The fact of the matter is that climate change is a partisan issue here in the United States, and this means in the best circumstances a split House, meaning no two-thirds majority. The Republican Party has their heels dug in, and without their opposition maintaining an overwhelming majority in the Senate, this agreement will not pass. Despite this fact, our president signed the Paris Agreement on Earth Day last Friday without Senate approval. This makes his signature a disingenuous commitment with no actual plan to follow through. How can we expect this agreement to be successful without the United States' involvement, especially after the precedent set by Kyoto? Now, suppose by chance that the Senate does ratify this agreement. What kind of legal ramifications can it have? Well, the Paris Agreement reads, I quote, for countries to meet their own voluntary targets on limiting emissions between 2020 and 2030. This is just kicking the can further down the road. What this means is that this country will not be held for their lack of commitment, which makes the agreement no different than a New Year's resolution. Echoing the wise words of Al Gore, countries of the developing world shall be exempt. Their first priority is to lift their citizens from poverty and build strong economies. The lack of political commitment has resurfaced as India has volunteered to do less than they have in recent years, and China intends to hold its emissions constant until 2030. Our world's top 3 contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are China, the United States, and India, all of which have politically postured against the agreement through their lack of commitment. Environmental concerns at home change depending on their impact on our daily life. For example, when gas prices are low, public support for drilling offshore is low. But as the gas prices go back up, the support for drilling offshore goes back up. This fluctuation of policy is a result of public support and pressures on the politicians to meet the needs of their constituents. The Heritage Institute estimates that if the Paris Agreement passes, we will lose over 400,000 jobs, household electricity bills will rise by over 20%, and we'll have an aggregated GDP loss of over $2.5 trillion. As these economic problems mount, it is likely that the public opinion will shift against the Paris Agreement. This is one of the main reasons America never committed to Kyoto Protocol. The Berne-Hagel Resolution outlined these economic concerns, and these sentiments have not changed. This economic strain is not localized to just the United States. It has also resulted in other nations missing their target goals, which is another reason that we won't see China or India abiding by it. Now, to summarize, yes, climate change is a global problem, but the Paris Agreement is not the solution. It has been shown that as a result of environmental issues being a partisan issue here at the United States, we'll be unable to financially contribute. Additionally, with the lack of will shown by China and India, who in combination with us emit over 50% of the global greenhouse gases, the Paris Agreement will follow the failed legacy of Kyoto. Instead, we need to take another path of mitigating the consequences of this inevitable crisis. Thank you.
I'd like to invite you guys to think about something rather interesting. We are here today at Irvine Valley College where the sun has been shining all day. But can you imagine in less than 100 years that our community could be underwater due to inland flooding? Reality is that the most recent National Climate Assessment Report projects that within the next century, Southern California will be vulnerable to unparalleled storm surges and weather destruction that will completely destroy Southern California's water supply. But we are better off than most. The San Francisco Bay region will be completely submerged by 2100, with water levels anticipated to rise several feet within the next century, 400% higher than centuries past. But not just California, the entire world is vulnerable to the effects of climate change, as the Arctic, Antarctic, and Pacific Island ecosystems remain endangered to the threats of melting ice and water level increases. Climate change is our reality. The past 20 years have been the hottest 20 years on record. Here in California, we've been placed under extreme drought watch, as little rainfall in the past 4 years has limited our water supply due to high water evaporation from increasing temperatures. As seen in this chart, our heat in our oceans is so high that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association has to make a new heat scale just to document it. But climate change is much more than a risk to our oceans. Although we will face some immediate effects in the next 50 years, if we surpass the 3 degrees Celsius mark, 30% of the global species will be up for extinction. And once past 4 degrees Celsius, 40% will be. If we pass 6 degrees Celsius, we are well on the path towards Earth's 6th mass extinction. In a study from the University of Connecticut, 1 out of every 6 species is up for extinction due to climate change. Let's take a look at some of the species most at risk. Although they are symbols of Christmas and festive cheer, reindeer are very at risk for extinction due to climate change. They will be extinct by the end of the century. This is the Atlantic puffin. They will be extinct in the next 30 years. And this is the American pika. The pika dies of heat stroke and weather over 80 degrees, and the pika will be extinct in the next 15 years. Is this something that should be inevitable? Should we spend the money necessary to prevent heat-related death, animal extinctions, and the destruction of ecosystems worth it? Absolutely. The Paris Agreement is the first ever international agreement where major political leaders have cooperated and made a complete agreement on carbon emissions. All United Nations countries have signed on to it, and it is an effort to limit this increase. Economically, a transition to weaning off fossil fuels and transition to pricier alternative sources does seem difficult, as mentioned by Joe. However, if anyone knows about economies, you should know that alternative sources haven't been developed on such a large scale, making them a lot more costly. In fact, so many carbon-free emission sources are being developed, from using reflective plate on a building for solar power, to burning algae for energy, to even using oceanic waves for hydroelectric energy. These new markets with economies of scale account for 30% of energy industry growth, but accounts for less than 4% of the total market. By encouraging Paris 2015, countries are inclined to support these industries, which is supporting economic growth. Plus, for those on the money side, think about this. What is more costly? Investing in low-carbon energy emission sources, or trying to cover the losses of cities and water supplies for your businesses? Rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina cost $1.25 billion. But about $3 trillion of assets are at risk today, a tally on track to reach $35 trillion by 2070. If a city goes down from increasing water volatility, or if a population loses water, the financial losses are catastrophic. And we have more than New Orleans to worry about. Tokyo, Shanghai, Miami, and even New York City are places most at risk due to climate change. With all that at stake, the lack of a binding emissions goal in Paris 2015 becomes more of a benefit rather than a capability for failure. Governments want to prevent disaster, and with the increase of droughts, weather changes, and environment change, they will feel the pressure to cut emissions and help out their communities. Plus, it's the most feasible option to invest, rather than face those disasters. Not saying that taking action after Paris is easy. There are skeptics on the necessity of fighting climate change, such as those from the Kyoto Institute, Heritage Foundation, like Joe mentioned, and the Americans for Prosperity. But what do these skeptics of climate change have in common? They were all funded by the Koch brothers, whose industries are responsible for emitting 24 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, with the intention of preventing to cut their emissions. Not to cut their emissions. Due to the company's insistence, the world is being held responsible for their consequences. Although the most devastating effects are in the long run, we should care. We should care that many of our lives are at potential risk, maybe even eventually your future family. Our people, our environment, our Earth, could be facing extremely drastic conditions that could halt the existence of life as we know it to be. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not the Paris Agreement is too little too late. The question we need to ask now is, if not now, then when? Thank you.
and science collide in addressing an existential threat to global civilization? This is the question that comes to mind when thinking about the Paris Agreement. And to be clear, it is not the argument on whether or not climate change exists, but it is recognizing that only after a marathon of hard negotiating, all nations finally agreed to reduce greenhouse gases. Is the Paris Agreement a huge milestone in the battle against climate change, or is it too little, too late? The Paris Agreement set long-term goals of keeping the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and aims to limit the increase of those temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, according to climate scientist James Rand, the agreement only comes into force in 2020, a time frame by which huge amounts of additional carbon dioxide will have already been pumped into the air, making it impossible to reach the targets set forth in the Paris Agreement. Even if the science was correct, there is no statement in the agreement that gives any clue to how this might be achieved besides voluntary contributions. Climate scientist John Christie stated that even if climate models were correct, a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 would avert only 7% of warming by the year 2100. This suggests that even if all countries kept their pledges, only a minute percentage of emissions would be reduced globally in the allotted time frame given by the Paris Agreement. Miles Allen, the head of the Climate Dynamics Group at Oxford University, stated that achieving a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century will require net carbon dioxide emissions to be reduced to 0. However, as long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will continue to be burned, making it a challenge for countries to simply cut their usage. So far, 60% of countries have made a formal emissions pledges that covers more than 75% of current global emissions. And while cutting carbon emissions could be a simple solution, the Paris Agreement does not take into account population growth and other issues that contribute to climate change. Even if emissions stopped growing today, global warming would still continue. We add greenhouse gases into the atmosphere far faster than they can be removed. And if it was possible to stop gas emissions, it would still not balance the flows. The planet will continue to warm, and we will continue to come closer to dangerous tipping points that will cause rapid, permanent warming and sea level rise. The Paris Agreement is a nice idea. It appeals to our lofty aspirations and our goals to address a major issue as a national society. However, there is a difference between our aspirations and the reality. And the reality shows that it is already too late to attack this issue within the framework given by the Paris Agreement. Climate scientist James Hansen stated that temperatures have already risen greatly and are on track to go past the 2-degree mark, even if every country contributed what they offered in the Paris Agreement. According to NASA, global temperatures have climbed 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. And while 1.4 degrees sounds trivial, it has caused our sea levels to rise by 12 inches. National Geographic